This is apropos. Well, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has arrived at the White House for talks with Donald Trump, the first foreign leader to be hosted by the US president since the Republican returned to power last month. On the agenda, negotiations for the second phase of the Gaza ceasefire, Iran and relations with Saudi Arabia. Well, for more, let's cross live now to Noga Tarnopolsky. She's our correspondent in Jerusalem. Firstly, Noga, Benjamin Netanyahu, as we say, the first foreign leader to be invited to the White House since Donald Trump returned to office. Firstly, how is all of this being viewed in Israel? How much of a boost, really, is this for the Israeli Prime Minister? If you can hear us, Noga, just firstly, how is this visit being viewed in Israel? Is it a big boost, we would presume, for the Israeli Prime Minister being the first foreign leader to be invited for talks at the White House since Donald Trump returned to office?
Well, it's obviously a matter of prestige, and Prime Minister Netanyahu himself in almost every press release has mentioned that he's the first leader to be invited, that he's the leader, the currently serving leader who's been invited to the White House more times than any other. All these kind of details, the number of nights he's spending at Blair House and so forth. I'm not sure, to be honest, how much impact it's having on Israelis. He has other problems in-house. There were 2 Israeli soldiers were killed today. The Prime Minister has yet to comment on that. There's this ongoing anguish of the families of hostages still held by Hamas. So there are other matters that are preoccupying Israelis much more than this visit, although, of course, it is being covered. It is being intensively even viewed, especially regarding the fate of the same hostages, who are at the center of almost everything in the Israeli public sphere right now.
And how much pressure is the Israeli Prime Minister coming under then at home to move on to the second phase of the ceasefire deal? Do you think that he's perhaps likely to try to delay that? What kind of tactics do you think he's going to be bringing into this meeting with Donald Trump at the White House?
Well, it's an excellent question. Today, we've already heard leaks from the Prime Minister's entourage all day long about how Israel will accept, I'm quoting here, Israel will accept the elongation of phase 1 of this deal if the Americans ask for it, which is a coy way of saying that it's what the Israelis hope. Netanyahu is facing tremendous pressure in-house in 2 opposite regards. On the one hand, from the vast majority of the Israeli people, close to 80% of Israelis want the war to end and the hostages to come back home, even if that means that remnants of Hamas will remain in Gaza. That's quite an extraordinary position for such a vast majority of Israelis to have a year and 3.5 months after Hamas's attack on the Israeli south. On the other hand, the Prime Minister is facing real challenges to his hold on power. His finance minister, for example, has said flat out that there will be no phase 2 to this deal, and that if there is, he will not only quit the government, he will topple the government. Phase 2 negotiations involve the complete withdrawal of Israeli troops from Gaza and the return of all the hostages, a kind of final end to this war. Netanyahu fears that he will not be able to remain in power if that's what comes about. And we've already seen interesting divergences. For example, Steve Witkoff, President Trump's envoy to the Middle East, said today in public that negotiations on phase 2 have already started, whereas the Israeli team is saying out loud that the the negotiation team, kind of a B team that Prime Minister Netanyahu has authorized to send to Doha for these negotiations, are merely to please Donald Trump and have no authority to even discuss phase 2. So it's unclear what's happening, but there is a tussle, a public tussle between the White House and the Israeli government.
regardless of what we may be reading into the images that we're seeing coming from Washington. Noga, stay with us. We will come back to you, but let's bring in Barbara Slavin. She's a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center in Washington and also a lecturer in international affairs at George Washington University. Barbara, thanks so much for being with us on the programme. This meeting between Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump, it's underway. We saw the Israeli Prime Minister arriving at the White House just a few minutes ago. We heard there from Noga, Netanyahu's far-right allies insisting that there's not going to be a phase 2 of this ceasefire deal. But surely that is going to be one of the priorities for Donald Trump going into this meeting. How much pressure do you think he's going to be applying on Benjamin Netanyahu to move this ceasefire along to ensure that it is successful?
First of all, thanks for having me. I think we're going to have to wait and see. They're supposed to have a joint press conference after their talks have concluded, so perhaps we'll be able to tell something from that and from the body language in particular. Trump seems to want this particular phase of the war to end. He's been pretty clear about that, so I expect he's going to put a lot of pressure on Netanyahu, and he has tremendous leverage. He has the leverage of arms sales. They've just announced they want to, I think, sell another $1 billion worth of bombs to Israel. He has, of course, the issue of Iran, which is very, very important to Netanyahu, has been for decades. We saw that the president agreed to some sanctions, new sanctions enforcement, but rather reluctantly. So I'm sure they're going to talk about that. But at the same time, Trump has said that the ceasefire might not hold. So I think he's giving himself some wiggle room. The bigger question for me is sort of what comes next. And Trump, again, in remarks to journalists, has talked about cleaning out Gaza, making everyone there move somewhere else while the rubble is removed and it's somehow refurbished. And how he could do that, it seems impossible to me. But I'm sure that's something else that they're talking about.
Yeah, and he reiterated that before going into those talks this evening. Hamas has come back in the last few minutes saying that those remarks are a recipe for creating chaos in the Middle East. That obviously not going down well with the militant group. So how difficult is this next phase going to be, Barbara? And does Donald Trump have the patience for the details, or does he just want this to be done and dusted, as it were?
Donald Trump doesn't have a great deal of patience. If this all falls apart, he'll move on to something else. He'll move on to Ukraine or maybe an Iran nuclear deal. We have not seen any kind of consistency from him when it comes to these issues. He and his envoy were happy enough to take credit for the ceasefire, that the mere fact of their taking office pushed it through somehow. We've seen a number of hostages come home. Obviously, everyone would like to see all the hostages come home. But I worry about his staying power. I worry about his span of attention when it comes to anything in particular, and that includes the Middle East.
And Barbara, Donald Trump also saying that he's planning to ramp up the pressure on Iran, presumably one area where those two men do see eye to eye. What do you think that kind of pressure is going to entail?
Well, again, we're waiting to see whether there has been any direct contact between the Trump administration and the Iranians. So far, I don't think there has been, and it's not even clear to me that Steve Witkoff, his envoy when it comes to Arab-Israeli issues, will also be his envoy on Iran. He has announced that he will tighten enforcement of existing sanctions. A lot of that will have to do with China, which buys a great deal of Iranian oil at a discount. So will the Chinese play ball? Is that going to be an element of Trump's conversations with the Chinese about tariffs and a number of other issues? And I think the Iranians are steeling themselves, that they've expressed an interest in talking, but they're not going to give up their entire nuclear program. Anyone who thinks they will is kidding themselves. So I'm not hugely optimistic. I think there are some openings, some possibilities, but it's going to take patience. It's going to take skill. And I've yet to see that demonstrated by the Trump White House.
And just in the last few minutes as well, Donald Trump, even though he's gone into that meeting, we're getting notifications here from Reuters. He's talking about Saudi Arabia, saying the Saudis are now not demanding a Palestinian state, even though that has been something that they said they would only agree to normalization with Israel if that was in place and if there was a credible pathway to a Palestinian state. So do you think that this is something Donald Trump is going to push for during those talks with Benjamin Netanyahu? Are you expecting any developments there?
Well, he certainly would like to have Saudi Arabia normalize relations with Israel. But again, without some concrete concessions, and especially if we have more ethnic cleansing in Gaza, if there's an effort to somehow remove 2 million people who live there amid the rubble, I just don't see how Mohammed bin Salman could go through with any kind of normalization deal.
And Noga, let's bring Noga back in, our correspondent in Jerusalem. These two men had a close relationship during Donald Trump's first presidency. How close are they now? And just a little more widely, how damaged has the US-Israeli relationship been by the Biden administration, or has it?
I don't think the Israeli-American relationship in any way was damaged by the Biden administration. In fact, the Biden administration offered Israel something very close to unfettered support in Israel's most difficult hour. I think it's important maybe to go back for a moment and remember the violence of Hamas's attack against Israel on October 7th, 2023, and the immediate full-on diplomatic and military support that the United States gave Israel and basically continued to give Israel to the end. Obviously, it's a very different style with Biden and with Netanyahu. And Netanyahu's perceived Trump all along as a much more convenient president for him. Netanyahu seems persuaded that he can manipulate Trump. He might. I don't know, obviously, and we don't know what's going on in that meeting. But Trump and Netanyahu have clearly divergent direct interests right now. Donald Trump wants to be perceived as a global peacemaker. He tells almost every writer who's interviewed him that he deserves the Nobel Prize, that he should have already gotten it. He seems to be aiming for some sort of regional mark that will be, absolutely linked to him as a token of success. I want to add one other thing that we haven't yet mentioned. The families of Israeli hostages held by Hamas have basically given up on Benjamin Netanyahu. Just before I joined you tonight, a right-wing pundit on an Israeli TV station said it openly. He said Netanyahu has no political interest in freeing the hostages. So when we say everyone has that interest, I'm not sure it's true, as hard as that may be to hear. And I think here we see a divergency. Donald Trump, under great influence from Miriam Adelson, one of his top supporters, and the widow of Sheldon Adelson, one of his most major supporters, she has influenced Trump and his administration greatly. The families of hostages basically began outreach through Adelson to the Trump team months ago already. And so we're seeing a divergence not only in Netanyahu's interest to stay in power, which Donald Trump doesn't seem particularly moved by, but also in the focus. The Trump team constantly talks about getting all the hostages out, the Israeli citizens, whereas the Israeli government seems to be aiming at a completely different goal, which is somehow finessing the rest of this deal with their coalition partners back in Israel and managing to stay in power.
Ladies, we'll have to leave it there for now. Thank you so much for being with us, both Noga and Barbara Slavin, Distinguished Fellow at the Stimson Center. Thank you so much. Do stay with us. We'll be right back with more World News.